Final Fantasy is a franchise that's dear to me. Lately, I can't help but think there's something off with the atmosphere surrounding the Final Fantasy brand. Is it possible that Final Fantasy is losing some of its renowned prestige? I'm not trying to make some sensational accusation that people don't play Final Fantasy anymore. I'm not trying to taint the franchise by suggesting it's horrible all of a sudden nobody likes it. I believe wholeheartedly Final Fantasy is still one of the most unique experiences one can have in gaming. It's a series with limitless possibilities and countless classics in its history. It's something that few game series could hope to be, a little bit of everything. I'm serious about that. Final Fantasy was designed from its inception to allow for an approach in game design not bound by one specific genre or theme. Final Fantasy can be any type of story, any kind of setting, with any kind of hero. When there's a new mainline Final Fantasy title, players both old and new have a fresh start, because each one is its own journey. The saga told in that particular game doesn't need you to remember 10 other games that came before it. It's never been difficult for me to become immersed into whatever new world I discover upon each new entry in the franchise. My biggest frustrations are usually linked to nitpicks and specific narrative choices. Still, Final Fantasy shouldn't be a hard sell to the general public. I think back to the PS3 and Xbox 360 era. There was something about that generation of Final Fantasy which made it feel like a big event. As a way of example, Final Fantasy XIII, love it or hate it, was a huge launch for those consoles. It was a historical moment in gaming. Square Enix was making the unprecedented move of transforming Final Fantasy into a truly international multi-platform franchise by releasing it on the Xbox 360. Consider for a moment, Square Enix understood the Xbox ecosystem was at the time growing, and it would behoove them to start establishing an audience within that ecosystem. When 13 and 15 released, both games held a lot of weight in the gaming ecosystem, even as some of the most divisive entries in the franchise. So what's changed since then? There are a couple things which stand out to me. The first of which is the landscape of gaming has shifted a lot since 2016 when Final Fantasy XV launched. Free-to-play games are everywhere now. These titles benefit from ease of entry and a live service content cycle which keeps players around for continuous revenue streams. Most of the top games in the industry in terms of notoriety and player counts are live service based. By players devoting that much more time into these constant cyclical games, it means less time players are spending on the other games, let alone new ones. For some more on this, I'll circle back to the player reach shortly. Let's take a quick moment to isolate an overview of the franchise from 2016 onward for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XV had a tumultuous history and a long development cycle, but Square Enix made its launch feel like a can't-miss event. They built up a massive amount of hype, which paid off in sales, even if the game didn't deliver as big as it promised. Final Fantasy XVI is the newest mainline title, and roughly a year later, we haven't seen any big sales updates from Square about the game. Most likely, we can estimate sales are between 3 to 5 million going off the initial numbers announced after launch. Square Enix indicated they were disappointed in the performance, as they also stated with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. With that in mind, let's just solidify a categorical examination of each Final Fantasy game following 2016. For context, and to save time, we will be avoiding any mobile games or older ports of games. This leaves us with the following titles: Final Fantasy VII Remake, Dissidia, Final Fantasy NT, Stranger of Paradise, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. This counts as a remaster, so it's technically not a straight port of an older game. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy VII Remake sold over 7 million copies across the original release and Intergrade's release. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth numbers are unknown, but it is believed to be somewhere north of 2 million copies. Estimates are harder to calculate for others due to lack of data and impressionable excitement from Square Enix regarding those titles. Final Fantasy VII Remake sold well because there was a lot of nostalgia hype for it, and it felt like a huge event for the franchise. The two biggest Final Fantasy games in the last 2 years failed to meet the expectations from Square Enix. We can say that perhaps their expectations are too high. but maybe they think from a different perspective from us. We know game development costs have gone up in the last decade. We also know there hasn't been one Final Fantasy game since Final Fantasy 15 to reach 10 million sales as of yet. There's plenty of time for more growth. Still, it's pretty telling when Final Fantasy 14 can reach the player counts that it does, and the mainline single-player entries struggle to reach a fraction of those numbers. My point isn't necessarily about the sales numbers exclusively. They are simply a useful tool in painting the overall picture of what I'm saying. Final Fantasy XIV is currently sitting at north of, I think it's 30 million registered users. Over 30 million people have played Final Fantasy XIV. How in the heck could Square Enix be seemingly unable to grow the Final Fantasy franchise when they have one of the most popular live service games as an active entry in that franchise? For some semi-connected context, let's use Assassin's Creed as a reference point. Having played and enjoyed Assassin's Creed Valhalla and pretty much every other Assassin's Creed title for the last, forever, I can't help but point out that every Final Fantasy game since 2016 is pretty much better overall than Assassin's Creed Valhalla. We're talking about a game which in 2 years generated $1 billion in revenue, sold well enough to generate free updates and expansions for 3 years, plus its own spin-off title, Assassin's Creed Mirage. All of this from a fun, albeit slightly above average game. Now don't misunderstand, I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom. I'm not trying to sit here and posit that the sky is falling. I'm trying to understand how a franchise I care about so much, and one which is so historically integral to gaming's legacy, could feel so much like an afterthought in the current landscape of gaming. Why shouldn't Final Fantasy be enjoying the same kind of success and notoriety as the Assassin's Creed franchise? To be fair, Final Fantasy is still a critical success with 16, 7 Remake, and 7 Rebirth, but it feels like there's something missing from how things were before. Well, perhaps Square Enix has done a bad job of managing the IP over the last 8 years. Let's explore the strong exclusivity push with Sony following Final Fantasy XV's launch. Sony pays a premium up front and signs a contract with Square to place the biggest Final Fantasy titles on PlayStation as timed exclusives, if they ever join other platforms at all. Essentially, Square Enix gambles each and every time they take Sony's money that it's going to be okay in the long run to treat PC and Xbox users like second-class citizens. Square might eventually release Final Fantasy Remake or other titles on PC later on down the line. With 7 Remake, it turned out to be a garbage port of the game, inferior in quality, and over a year after launch, no less. There's still no signs of a port for Xbox users. This is where I'll come back to the whole multi-platform thing I said I'd circle back to early in the video. Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth released as exclusives to PS5. There's no sign of an immediate PC or Xbox release. With games, Sony seems to show no interest in locking down like niche titles such as Stranger of Paradise and Crisis Core Final Fantasy Reunion. Square seemingly deems PC and Xbox users important enough to sell a game to. After all, Square knows that these niche titles are best served by the biggest possible reach. Still, Square has been so scattershot with its releases and which platforms they support with their games in recent years with the Final Fantasy franchise, it's a wonder they know what their plan for growing the brand even is at this point. By prioritizing short-term gains from signing contracts with Sony, Square Enix has established a cadence with the gaming industry that platform users from PC and Xbox are only worth their time when Square's games aren't worth Sony's money. Final Fantasy might be doing okay, but Square certainly hasn't grown the IP since signing exclusivity deals. As a matter of fact, outside the MMO success of Final Fantasy XIV Online, also on PC by the way, every single Final Fantasy game since 15 has sold less and less. Say whatever you want about Ubisoft and the quality of their games, the quality of the company itself, or the quality of the Assassin's Creed franchise in recent years. You know what though? Ubisoft has done one thing really well. They've marketed them through the roof and sold them everywhere they can. Assassin's Creed as a franchise is selling like hotcakes even after altering some of its franchise identity to divisive reception. Meanwhile, Square Enix hasn't enhanced their biggest brand in recent years. They've seemingly restrained it. Sony has probably gotten more out of their partnership with the Final Fantasy IP than Square Enix has or ever will. If Final Fantasy had never gone multi-platform, this wouldn't really be a problem. However, once Square decided to make it a true multi-platform powerhouse in the PS3 and 360 era, it became a brand in the gaming world akin to something like the Elder Scrolls franchise. Final Fantasy XIII, whatever you think about it, felt like an event. It was a game that people from every ecosystem took part in when it came out. When Final Fantasy XVI came out, half of the social media engagement I observed wasn't even talking about how good the game was. Half of it was console warrior gobbledygook about another PS5 exclusive. I don't know about anyone else, but why would a company like Square Enix want a franchise like Final Fantasy to be limited to existing as a feather in the cap of Sony's content library? Here's a food for thought situation as I start to close things out. People like to say things like, well, most Final Fantasy players are on the PlayStation anyway. Yes, this is true. However, if Square could sell 6 million copies on PlayStation, would they also like to sell 2 to 3 million copies on PC and Xbox combined? I'll answer this question with another question I ask of anyone listening. If you're in charge of the Final Fantasy IP, would you rather have 6 million people playing and talking about your IP, spreading brand awareness, or would you rather have 9 million people doing it? It seems after long last, Square has finally understood the silly constraints they've put on the Final Fantasy brand. Earlier this year, during company meetings, Square's leadership signaled a change is coming. They stated they would aggressively pursue a multi-platform strategy that includes Nintendo platforms, PlayStation, Xbox, and PCs. Clearly, Square realizes the need to start establishing a fan base on other ecosystems, because as I mentioned earlier regarding playtime, live service games are eating up more of the market and more playtime than ever before. Gaming changes in different ways across different generations. 10 years ago, the idea of the live service game was in its infancy. What was trending and constant then is different than it is now. Square took an approach that has in the long run limited their biggest franchise at present. Final Fantasy means so much to so many around the world, who enjoy and appreciate the adventures this franchise has offered. After seeing the stagnant state of the franchise over the last several years, it made me wonder what contributed to Final Fantasy feeling less relevant in our modern era, especially when a Western franchise like Assassin's Creed, which is still a single-player IP, can not only stay relevant, but grow at the same time. Although some recent narratives may not be as impactful as earlier franchise entries, Final Fantasy is just as fun and creative as it ever was. Of course, these are my own thoughts based on my observations over the last 6 years. While I've focused my opinion around these observations, there are a variety of thoughts about the franchise tied to different topics of debate. I'd love to hear about what you all think about different aspects of the Final Fantasy franchise or any concerns you have with it in the comments section down below. With that, we've come to the end of the video. Thanks for watching this all the way through, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed watching this video, please consider subscribing, clicking the like button, and hitting that little bell for notifications so you don't miss out on any new videos as soon as they drop. Thanks again, and have yourself a great day.